My husband abandoned me and our 3 children for his young secretary, claiming I was broken and couldn't give him the family he deserved. But when the DNA results finally came out, he discovered the most devastating truth imaginable. Our kids weren't even biologically his. And the baby his precious secretary was carrying, well, that wasn't his either, because it turns out he was the infertile one all along.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're a subscriber, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Tell us a duh.
Holding these test results in my trembling hands, my heart pounding with a mixture of vindication and disbelief. For 2 years, Ander Michaels had made me believe I was defective, that my body had failed our marriage, that I was the reason our family felt incomplete to him. He had humiliated me in front of friends, dismissed my tears, and ultimately discarded me like I was nothing more than a broken appliance that couldn't perform its basic function. But the truth, the earth-shattering, soul-crushing truth, was something he never saw coming. Ander thought he had everything figured out in his twisted mind. I was Susan Fontaine Michaels, the woman who had supposedly failed him, the wife whose body had turned their marriage into a disappointment. In his version of reality, I was the obstacle standing between him and the perfect family he felt he deserved. So without hesitation, without even a shred of remorse, he had walked away from me and our 3 beautiful children, Emma, age 8, Lucas, age 6, and little Sophie, just 4 years old, leaving us with nothing but his cruel accusations and a completely shattered life. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have possibly imagined, was that before he discarded us like we were nothing, I had already uncovered a truth that would obliterate his entire world just as thoroughly as he had destroyed mine. But let me take you back to the beginning, before the lies unraveled, before the betrayal cut so deep it left permanent scars, before I discovered just how catastrophically wrong Ander had been about everything. There was a time, not so long ago, when I genuinely believed that Ander and I were destined to grow old together, that we were building something beautiful and lasting. I still remember the first time I met him at that corporate conference in downtown Chicago. Ander Michaels had a presence that commanded attention, confident, articulate, successful. He was the kind of man who could walk into any room and immediately become its focal point. As a senior marketing executive at Fontaine & Associates, he carried himself with an easy assurance that made people want to be around him, a magnetic charisma that made it impossible to look away when he spoke. I had fallen for him completely and without reservation. Our love story had begun like something straight out of a romantic movie. The courtship had been intense and passionate, filled with surprise weekend getaways, handwritten letters, and promises whispered during long walks through Lincoln Park. When he proposed on the pier at Navy Pier, with the Chicago skyline glittering behind us and Lake Michigan stretching endlessly into the horizon, I had been absolutely certain that Ander was the man I would spend the rest of my life loving. The wedding had been everything I had ever dreamed of, elegant, intimate, held at the Botanical Gardens in Glencoe, with our closest family and friends surrounding us. I can still picture the way the late afternoon sunlight filtered through the glass conservatory, casting everything in a warm, golden glow. Ander had looked so handsome in his charcoal gray suit, and when he'd taken my hands during our vows, his voice had been steady and full of conviction as he promised to love and cherish me through whatever life might bring. For the first year of our marriage, it truly felt like we were living in that fairy tale. We were completely wrapped up in each other's worlds, spending our evenings curled up on the overstuffed sectional in our Lincoln Square apartment, talking about our dreams, our future, the family we wanted to build together. Ander would trace patterns on my hand during our weekend morning coffee rituals, stealing glances at me over his newspaper as if I was the most fascinating thing he'd ever encountered. We had been genuinely, deeply happy. And then, slowly but unmistakably, everything began to change. It started so subtly that I almost missed it at first. Ander began staying late at the office more frequently, claiming that the new account he was managing required extra attention. His goodnight kisses became more perfunctory, his weekend attention more distracted. When I would ask him about his day over dinner, his responses grew shorter, less detailed, as if sharing the mundane moments of his life with me had become a chore rather than a pleasure. I convinced myself it was normal, that the intense honeymoon phase of our relationship was simply evolving into something more mature and sustainable. Every marriage went through adjustments, right? This was just the natural progression of two people learning to build a life together. But then, the silences grew longer and more uncomfortable. I started noticing the way Ander would check his phone constantly during our conversations, his fingers moving quickly across the screen as he typed responses to messages that apparently couldn't wait. When I asked who he was texting so urgently, he would offer vague explanations about work emergencies or important client communications that needed immediate attention. The first real crack in my denial came on a Thursday evening in October. I had spent the entire afternoon preparing Ander's favorite meal, braised short ribs with garlic mashed potatoes and roasted Brussels sprouts, hoping to recreate one of those intimate evenings we used to share so effortlessly. I had lit candles, opened a bottle of the Cabernet we'd been saving for a special occasion, and even put on the blue dress he'd always said made my eyes look stunning.
But when Ander walked through the door that night, he barely glanced at the carefully set table or acknowledged the effort I'd put into the evening. Instead, he headed straight for the shower, mumbling something about being exhausted and needing to decompress. We ate in near silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging heavy between us like a storm cloud ready to burst. Every attempt I made at conversation was met with distracted nods or monosyllabic responses. It was as if the man I'd married had been replaced by a stranger who looked exactly like him but felt nothing for me whatsoever. "Is everything okay?" I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper as I watched him push food around his plate without really eating. He looked up briefly, and for just a moment I caught something in his expression. Guilt, maybe? Or frustration. But then he shook his head and returned his attention to his phone. "Yeah, just work stuff, you know how it is." But I didn't know how it was because this wasn't the man who used to tell me about every detail of his day, who used to seek my advice on difficult decisions, who used to make me feel like his most trusted confidant and closest friend. That was the night I realized that somewhere along the way, I had started losing my husband and I had no idea how to get him back. That night marked the beginning of what I would later recognize as the systematic destruction of our marriage. Though at the time, I was still desperately clinging to hope that whatever was happening between us could be fixed. Over the following weeks, Ander's behavior became even more erratic and distant. He started coming home later and later, sometimes not until well after midnight. When I would wait up for him, concerned about where he'd been, he would brush past me with barely a glance, claiming he'd been stuck in marathon client meetings or dealing with urgent project deadlines that couldn't wait until morning. But something about his explanations never quite added up. The cologne he wore had always been the same woody, masculine scent I'd bought him for our first anniversary. But now I caught traces of something different, something lighter, more floral, distinctly feminine. When I mentioned it, he laughed it off, saying one of his female colleagues had been wearing particularly strong perfume during their late meeting. His clothes told a similar story of inconsistencies. Ander had always been meticulous about his appearance, but now his shirts sometimes came home with small stains I couldn't identify, or wrinkled in ways that suggested they'd been hastily put back on. Once I found a long blonde hair on his jacket sleeve, much longer and lighter than my own auburn waves. But when I pointed it out, he claimed it must have come from the elevator or the dry cleaner. I wanted to believe him. God, how desperately I wanted to believe that there was an innocent explanation for all of these small, nagging details that were slowly eating away at my peace of mind. The real breaking point came when I discovered I was pregnant with Sophie. I had been so excited to surprise Ander with the news. After Emma and Lucas, we had talked about having a third child, and I thought this baby would be exactly what our marriage needed, a fresh start, a new source of joy to bring us back together. I planned an elaborate surprise, cooking his favorite dinner and presenting him with a small wrapped box containing a pair of tiny baby booties and the positive test results.
Instead of the joy and excitement I had expected, Anders' face went completely pale.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
He stared at the test for what felt like an eternity, his jaw working as if he was trying to process something incredibly difficult. He asked finally, his voice strangely flat, "Are you sure?" "Of course I'm sure," I replied, confused by his reaction. "I took 3 tests. We're having another baby, Ander. Isn't this wonderful?" But instead of sweeping me into his arms the way he had when I told him about Emma and Lucas, Anders set the test down on the counter and ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I'd learned to recognize as a sign of his frustration or stress. I wasn't expecting this right now," he said carefully. "With everything going on at work, the timing isn't ideal." His response felt like a physical blow. This wasn't the man who used to tell me about every detail of his day, who used to seek my advice on difficult decisions, who used to make me feel like his most trusted confidant and closest friend. That was the night I realized that somewhere along the way, I had started losing my husband and I had no idea how to get him back. That night marked the beginning of what I would later recognize as the systematic destruction of our marriage. Though at the time, I was still desperately clinging to hope that whatever was happening between us could be fixed. Over the following weeks, Anders' behavior became even more erratic and distant. He started coming home later and later, sometimes not until well after midnight. When I would wait up for him, concerned about where he'd been, he would brush past me with barely a glance, claiming he'd been stuck in marathon client meetings or dealing with urgent project deadlines that couldn't wait until morning. But something about his explanations never quite added up. The cologne he wore had always been the same woody, masculine scent I'd bought him for our first anniversary. But now I caught traces of something different, something lighter, more floral, distinctly feminine. When I mentioned it, he laughed it off, saying one of his female colleagues had been wearing particularly strong perfume during their late meeting. His clothes told a similar story of inconsistencies. Ander had always been meticulous about his appearance, but now his shirts sometimes came home with small stains I couldn't identify, or wrinkled in ways that suggested they'd been hastily put back on. Once I found a long blonde hair on his jacket sleeve, much longer and lighter than my own auburn waves, but when I pointed it out, he claimed it must have come from the elevator or the dry cleaner. I wanted to believe him. God, how desperately I wanted to believe that there was an innocent explanation for all of these small, nagging details that were slowly eating away at my peace of mind. The real breaking point came when I discovered I was pregnant with Sophie. I had been so excited to surprise Ander with the news. After Emma and Lucas, we had talked about having a third child, and I thought this baby would be exactly what our marriage needed, a fresh start, a new source of joy to bring us back together. I planned an elaborate surprise, cooking his favorite dinner and presenting him with a small wrapped box containing a pair of tiny baby booties and the positive test results. Instead of the joy and excitement I had expected, Anders' face went completely pale. He stared at the test for what felt like an eternity, his jaw working as if he was trying to process something incredibly difficult. He asked finally, his voice strangely flat, "Are you sure?" "Of course I'm sure," I replied, confused by his reaction. "I took 3 tests. We're having another baby, Ander. Isn't this wonderful?" But instead of sweeping me into his arms the way he had when I told him about Emma and Lucas, Anders set the test down on the counter and ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I'd learned to recognize as a sign of his frustration or stress. I wasn't expecting this right now," he said carefully. "With everything going on at work, the timing isn't ideal."
I was too nauseated and exhausted to argue with her, but her words stung deeply. When I mentioned the comment to Ander later that evening, hoping for some support or reassurance, he simply shrugged and said his mother was just worried about my health. As my pregnancy progressed, Edie's visits became more frequent and her observations more cruel. "Ander deserves a house full of children," she would say while watching me struggle to keep up with Emma and Lucas while dealing with third trimester exhaustion. "A strong family line is so important for a successful man. I do hope this pregnancy goes better than your others seem to." The implication was clear. I was somehow failing at the most basic function expected of a wife, and my inability to make pregnancy look effortless was a source of disappointment for everyone around me. But the worst part wasn't Edie's constant criticism. It was the way Ander never defended me, never told his mother that her comments were inappropriate or hurtful. Instead, he would sit silently during her visits, occasionally nodding along with her observations as if he agreed with her assessment of my inadequacies. When Sophie was born, I thought things might change. She was perfect, a beautiful, healthy baby with Anders' dark eyes and my stubborn chin. I had expected her arrival to soften whatever had hardened in Anders' heart, to remind him of why we had wanted to build a family together in the first place. For a brief moment, it seemed like it might work. Ander held Sophie in the hospital with something that looked like wonder in his eyes, and when the nurses commented on how much she resembled him, I saw a flash of the pride and joy that had been missing for so long. But that moment of connection was fleeting. Within weeks of bringing Sophie home, Ander seemed to retreat even further into himself. He showed little interest in the middle-of-the-night feedings, the diaper changes, or any of the countless small tasks that come with caring for a newborn. When Sophie would cry, he would leave the room rather than try to comfort her, claiming that babies preferred their mothers anyway. It was around this time that Anders' work schedule became even more demanding, or at least that's what he claimed. He started taking business trips that seemed to come up at the last minute, disappearing for days at a time, with vague explanations about client presentations or team-building retreats that required his immediate attention. "I'm sorry, Susan," he would say, already packing his suitcase while I stood in our bedroom doorway holding a crying Sophie. "The Peterson account needs extra attention, and Mark thinks I'm the only one who can handle the client relationship properly." Mark Jerome was Anders' direct supervisor, a man I'd met only a handful of times at company events. Whenever I suggested that perhaps some of these urgent trips could be handled by other team members, Ander would get defensive, claiming I didn't understand the pressures of his job or the competitive nature of his industry. But what I did understand was that I was essentially raising 3 children alone, while my husband lived what appeared to be a completely separate life. The breaking point came during what should have been our happiest family moment. It was Lucas's 6th birthday, and I had spent weeks planning an elaborate celebration at our house. I had decorated the backyard with superhero themes, arranged for a bounce house, and invited all of his little friends from school. Emma had helped me make homemade Batman cupcakes, and even baby Sophie seemed to sense the excitement, cooing and smiling more than usual. Ander had promised to be there. He had specifically cleared his calendar and assured me that nothing would interfere with Lucas's special day. But as the party time approached and the first guests began arriving, Ander was nowhere to be found. His phone went straight to voicemail, and my texts remained unanswered. I found myself making excuses to the other parents, explaining that Daddy was running late from an important meeting but would be there soon. Lucas kept asking where his father was, his little face falling each time another friend's dad arrived while his own remained mysteriously absent. I watched my son's excitement slowly transform into disappointment, and something inside me began to crack. Ander finally showed up 3 hours later, just as we were cleaning up the last of the party debris. He walked into the backyard with his tie loosened and his hair slightly disheveled, offering a perfunctory apology about an emergency client crisis that had required his immediate attention. "Sorry I'm late, buddy," he said to Lucas, ruffling his hair in a gesture that felt more obligatory than affectionate. But Lucas, with the brutal honesty that only children possess, looked up to his father and said, "You missed my whole party. Tommy's dad helped us with the piñata, and Sarah's dad fixed the bounce house when it got a hole. Where were you?" The hurt in my son's voice was unmistakable, and for a moment, I thought I saw something like guilt flash across Ander's face. But instead of apologizing sincerely or trying to make it up to Lucas, he deflected. "Sometimes grown-ups have to do important things, Lucas. You'll understand when you're older." That night, after the children were finally asleep, I confronted Ander directly. "This can't continue," I said, finding him in his home office, supposedly catching up on emails. "You missed your son's entire birthday party. Do you understand how that felt for him? For me? Ander didn't even look up from his laptop screen. It was one party, Susan. There will be other birthdays. That's not the point, I replied, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. You're never here anymore. The kids barely see you, and when you are home, you act like we're strangers. What's happening to us?
Finally, he looked at me, and what I saw in his eyes was something I'd never seen before: cold indifference. Maybe, he said slowly, the problem is that you expect too much. Not every man wants to spend his evenings changing diapers and playing pretend. Some of us have actual responsibilities. His words hit me like a physical slap. This was the man who had once told me that being a father was the most important role he could ever have, who had spent hours reading parenting books and researching the best ways to support child development. Since when is taking care of your own children not an actual responsibility? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Ander closed his laptop with a sharp snap. Since I started realizing that maybe I want more from my life than this endless cycle of domestic obligations. Some women make family life feel effortless and joyful. Others... He let the sentence hang in the air, but his meaning was crystal clear. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling while Ander slept peacefully beside me, and I finally admitted to myself what I had been trying to deny for months. My husband was having an affair. The realization didn't come as a shock, exactly. All the signs had been there. The late nights, the mysterious phone calls, the sudden disinterest in our family life, the way he seemed to find fault with everything I did. But acknowledging it felt like stepping off a cliff into free fall. I spent the next few days in a strange state of numbness, going through the motions of caring for the children and managing our household, while my mind raced with questions I wasn't sure I wanted answered. Who was she? How long had it been going on? Did he love her? Was he planning to leave us? The answer to that last question came sooner than I expected. It was a Tuesday evening in November when Ander came home with an expression I'd never seen before. Determined, almost relieved, as if he'd finally made a decision he'd been wrestling with for a long time. "Susan," he said, not even bothering to take off his coat, "we need to talk." The way he said those 4 words made my blood run cold. There was a finality in his tone that told me everything I needed to know before he even opened his mouth to continue. I was in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner, while the kids watched a movie in the living room. Sophie was in her high chair, contentedly mashing Cheerios between her tiny fingers, while Emma and Lucas were curled up on the couch arguing over which cartoon to watch next. It was such a normal, domestic scene, the kind of evening that Ander had once smiled with contentment. But now, as he stood in the doorway, still wearing his expensive charcoal suit, he looked at our family life with something that resembled disgust. "We need to talk," he repeated when I didn't immediately respond, my hands frozen around the plate that I'd been washing. "About what?" I asked, though part of me already knew. There was something in his posture, the way he was holding himself apart from us, that suggested this conversation had been rehearsed. About us. About this marriage. About the fact that it's not working anymore. I set the plate down carefully in the sink, my hands trembling slightly. "What do you mean it's not working? We can fix whatever's wrong, Ander. We can go to counseling. We can—" "No, Susan." His voice was firm, cutting through my desperate suggestions. "We can't fix this, because the problem isn't something that can be counseled away. The problem is fundamental." He moved into the kitchen then, but kept the island between us, as if he needed a physical barrier to have this conversation. Behind us, I could hear the cheerful sounds of the kids' cartoon, a stark contrast to the horrible tension building in our kitchen. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," Ander continued, his voice taking on the measured tone he used in business presentations. "About what I want for my life, about what makes me happy, about what kind of future I want to build. And apparently that future doesn't include your wife and children." The words came out sharper than I intended, but I was starting to feel a familiar surge of anger cutting through my shock. "It's not that simple,"
he said, though he had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. I care about you, Susan. I care about the kids, but caring about someone and being able to build a life with them are two different things. I stared at him, this man I had loved so completely, trying to understand when he had become such a stranger. What are you saying exactly? Ander took a deep breath, as if he was preparing to deliver a presentation to a difficult client. I'm saying that I think we want different things. You seem content with this. He gestured around our kitchen, encompassing our entire domestic life in one dismissive wave. But I need more. More than a family who loves you, more than children who worship the ground you walk on, more than a wife who has spent the last 8 years trying to build a life with you. For the first time since he'd started this conversation, Ander looked directly at me, and what I saw in his eyes was something I'd never seen before. Pity. Susan, you're a good mother. No one could deny that, but being a good mother isn't the same as being a good wife. And honestly, I don't think you're capable of being the kind of partner I need. The words hit me like a physical blow. What kind of partner do you need, Ander? Because I thought I was being exactly the kind of partner you wanted when we got married. I thought we wanted the same things. We did want the same things, he agreed. Or at least, I thought we did. But people change. People grow. And sometimes they grow in different directions.
There was something in the way he said it that made me suspicious. This wasn't just about growing apart or wanting different things. This was about someone specific. Who is she? I asked quietly. Ander's face went very still. Who is who? Don't insult my intelligence, I said, my voice gaining strength. The late nights, the business trips, the way you can barely stand to touch me anymore. There's someone else. Who is she? For a moment, I thought he might deny it, but then something shifted in his expression, and I realized he was almost relieved to have it out in the open. Her name is Bree, he said simply. Bree Sanders. She's my assistant. Of course. The young, blonde secretary I'd met briefly at company Christmas parties. The one who always seemed to have urgent documents that needed Ander's immediate attention, who dressed impeccably and spoke with the kind of polished confidence that made her seem older than her 25 years. How long? I asked. 6 months, he answered without hesitation, as if he'd been prepared for this question. 6 months, which meant it had started right around the time Sophie was born, right when I had been at my most vulnerable, recovering from childbirth and trying to manage 3 children under the age of 8. And you think she's the kind of partner you need? I asked, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. Yes, Ander said, and for the first time during this entire conversation, his voice softened slightly. She understands my ambitions, my career goals. She supports my dreams instead of constantly pulling me back into domestic obligations. Domestic obligations, I repeated slowly. You mean like taking care of your children? I mean like having a wife who expects me to be home for every birthday party and family dinner, who wants to discuss diaper brands and preschool applications instead of my professional achievements, who seems content to live in this suburban bubble forever. The cruelty in his words was breathtaking. This was the life we had chosen together, the dreams we had built side by side. And now he was describing it as if it had been some kind of trap I had set for him. So what happens now? I asked. I want a divorce, he said simply. I'll be fair about support and custody arrangements, of course, but I can't pretend anymore that this marriage is something it isn't. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, while Ander slept in the guest room, his words echoing in my mind like a poison that had been slowly released into my bloodstream. The house felt different somehow, as if the very foundation had shifted beneath us, and I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. But what haunted me most wasn't just the revelation of his affair, or even his casual cruelty in describing our family as domestic obligations. It was something else he had said, something that had lodged itself in my chest like a splinter I couldn't quite reach. She understands my ambitions, my career goals. She supports my dreams instead of constantly pulling me back. The implication was clear. I had been holding him back. I had been the anchor dragging down his soaring aspirations. And somewhere in that accusation was another, more subtle message. That our children, our family, the life we had built together was somehow insufficient for a man of his caliber. Over the next few days, Ander moved through our house like a ghost, present but not really there. He slept in the guest room, claiming he needed space to think, though I suspected he was spending most of his evenings texting his precious Bree. He was polite but distant with the children, treating them with the kind of careful courtesy you might show to acquaintances' kids rather than your own flesh and blood. Emma, at 8 years old, was old enough to sense that something was terribly wrong. She became clingy and anxious, following me around the house and asking repeatedly if Daddy was sick or angry about something she had done. Lucas, always sensitive to emotional undercurrents, started having nightmares and wetting the bed again after months of being dry through the night. And Sophie, though too young to understand the tension, seemed to pick up on the atmosphere, becoming fussier and harder to comfort. Watching my children suffer because of Ander's emotional abandonment sparked something fierce and protective in me. Whatever was happening between us, they didn't deserve to be casualties of his midlife crisis. It was during this awful liminal period, when we were technically still married but already living like strangers, that I made a discovery that would change everything. I was going through some old photo albums, trying to find pictures for Emma's school project about family history, when I came across our wedding album. As I flipped through the pages, looking at images of what had seemed like the happiest day of my life, I found myself studying Ander's face in the photographs. He looked so young, so genuinely happy. In one picture, he was laughing at something my father had said during the reception, his head thrown back with pure joy. In another, he was gazing at me during our first dance, with an expression of such tender love that it made my chest ache to see it now. Had I imagined that happiness? Had it all been an act, even then? That's when I noticed something that made me pause. In several of the photos, particularly the ones taken during the ceremony itself, Ander looked slightly uncomfortable. Not nervous, that would have been normal for a groom, but there was something in his expression that seemed almost strained. Curious now, I pulled out the albums from our early years of marriage, studying them with new eyes. There were photos from our honeymoon in Italy, from the baby shower before Emma was born, from Lucas's first birthday. And in many of them, while I looked radiantly happy, Ander's smiles seemed forced, his eyes distant. How had I never noticed this before?
Then I found the photo that stopped me cold. It was from Emma's first birthday party, taken in the backyard of our old apartment. Emma was sitting in her high chair, chocolate cake smeared across her face, while Ander stood behind her with his hands on her shoulders. I was next to them, beaming with maternal pride. But as I looked at the photo now, really looked at it, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Ander wasn't looking at Emma with the expression of a proud father. He was looking at her with something that seemed almost like confusion, as if he was trying to figure out why he was supposed to feel connected to this little person. And suddenly, with a clarity that was both terrifying and liberating, I realized what had been nagging at me all these years. Ander had never really bonded with the children. Not just since his affair started, but from the very beginning. I had attributed his initial awkwardness to new father nerves, his gradual withdrawal to work stress and the natural challenges of parenthood. But looking at these photos now, I could see a pattern. I had been too in love, too hopeful, too desperate to believe in our family to notice before. He had been going through the motions of fatherhood without ever truly feeling it, which raised a question that made my hands tremble as I held the photo. Why? That night, after the children were finally asleep, I confronted this realization head-on. I called my sister Julie, the only person I trusted enough to voice the terrible suspicion that was growing in my mind. "I think there might be something wrong with our family picture," I told her, my voice barely above a whisper as I paced around my bedroom. "Something I never let myself see before." "What do you mean?" Julie asked, and I could hear the concern in her voice. "I mean, I think maybe Andrew's distance from the kids isn't just about his affair. I think maybe there's a reason he never really bonded with them the way other fathers do." There was a long pause before Julie spoke again. "Susan, what are you thinking?" I took a deep breath, hardly believing I was about to say the words out loud. "I'm thinking maybe it's time I found out if the children are actually his." The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, Julie spoke, her voice carefully controlled. "How long have you been wondering about this?" "I haven't been," I admitted. "Not consciously. But now that I'm really thinking about it, looking back at everything, Julie, he's never acted like their father. Not really. And I need to know why." The decision to get the DNA tests felt both terrifying and inevitable, like stepping off a cliff I couldn't see the bottom of. But once the thought had taken root in my mind, I couldn't shake it. Too many things suddenly made sense. Anders' emotional distance, his lack of natural paternal instincts, the way he sometimes looked at the children as if they were strangers he was obligated to care for. I spent 3 sleepless nights researching discrete DNA testing services, reading about collection methods and accuracy rates. Every rational part of my brain told me I was being paranoid, that grief and betrayal were making me imagine connections that didn't exist. But my gut, the same instinct that had been screaming at me for months that something was fundamentally wrong, wouldn't let me dismiss this possibility. The hardest part was collecting the samples without the children knowing. I felt like a criminal, carefully gathering hair from their brushes, swabbing the inside of their juice cups when they weren't looking. Each small act of deception felt like a betrayal of their innocent trust. But I had to know the truth. Anders' sample was easier to obtain. His electric razor collected enough material, and after 8 years of marriage, I knew his routines well enough to gather what I needed without raising suspicion. He was so wrapped up in his new romance anyway that he barely noticed my presence in our shared spaces. I sent the samples to 3 different testing companies, wanting to be absolutely certain of the results. The waiting period felt endless. 2 weeks that stretched like years while I went through the motions of normal life, caring for the children, managing household tasks, all while this enormous question mark hung over everything I thought I knew about my family. When the first results arrived via email, I was sitting in my car in the parking lot of Sophie's daycare. The children were all at their respective schools and activities, and I had finally worked up the courage to open the message that would either confirm my worst fears or prove that stress and heartbreak had made me imagine the impossible. My hands shook as I read the first line. The alleged father is excluded as the biological father of the tested child. Emma. The test showed that Anders was not Emma's biological father. I stared at the screen until the words blurred together, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. With trembling fingers, I opened the second email. Lucas. Same result. Then the third. Sophie. The conclusion was identical across all 3 tests. None of my children were biologically Anders. I sat in that parking lot for nearly an hour, watching other parents pick up their children, going about their normal Tuesday afternoon routines, while my entire world restructured itself around this devastating revelation. How was this possible? I had never had an affair, never been with anyone else during our marriage. The only explanation was that Anders himself was sterile. The word hit me like a physical blow. Anders was infertile and had been throughout our entire marriage, which meant that every cruel comment about my supposed inability to give him children,
every accusation that I was somehow defective, every moment of shame and self-doubt he had caused me to feel, all of it had been projection.
He was the one who couldn't have children. He was the one whose body had failed our marriage. And somehow, on some level, he must have known or at least suspected this truth, which explained his emotional distance from the kids, his inability to bond with them the way natural fathers do. But if Ander wasn't their father, then who was? The answer came to me slowly, pieces of memory clicking into place like a puzzle I hadn't realized I was solving. Dr. Carl Fontaine, my fertility specialist from years ago when we had been trying to get pregnant with Emma. The handsome, compassionate doctor who had been so understanding about our difficulties conceiving, who had suggested a series of procedures and treatments that I had undergone while Ander waited in the lobby. Dr. Fontaine, who had assured me that the artificial insemination procedures he was performing would give us the family we dreamed of, who had explained that sometimes the male partner sample needed to be enhanced with donor material to improve the chances of success, who had been so confident that his methods would work and had been right. I had gotten pregnant with Emma within 2 months of starting treatment. And then, when we had wanted more children, we had returned to Dr. Fontaine for Lucas and later for Sophie. Each time he had used the same enhanced procedures. Each time I had gotten pregnant quickly and easily. I had never questioned the science behind it. I had been so grateful to finally be having the babies we wanted that I hadn't thought to ask for details about exactly whose genetic material was being used to create our children. Now I understood why Ander had never truly bonded with them. On some instinctive level, he had known they weren't his. The revelation about Dr. Fontaine sent me spiraling into a new kind of shock. I drove home in a daze, my mind racing through implications I wasn't ready to fully process. If my suspicions were correct, if Dr. Fontaine had used his own genetic material instead of properly sourced donor sperm, then my children weren't just not Anders, they were the products of a massive medical deception that had been perpetrated against both of us. But as devastating as this discovery was, it also gave me something I hadn't expected: power. For months, Ander had been systematically destroying my self-worth, making me believe that I was the broken one, the failure, the reason our marriage and family weren't enough for him. He had left me feeling like damaged goods, discarded for a younger, more fertile woman who could supposedly give him what I couldn't. Now I knew the truth. Ander was the infertile one. Ander was the one whose body had failed to create the children he claimed to want so desperately. And if my suspicions about his precious Bree were correct, if she was indeed pregnant as the office gossips had been whispering, then her baby wasn't his either. That evening, I watched Ander interact with the children during what he had announced would be one of his last dinners at home before moving out permanently. He was going through the motions of being a father, asking Emma about her school project and helping Lucas cut his chicken, but there was no warmth in it, no genuine connection. It was all performance, the kind of obligatory attention you might pay to your friend's children during a dinner party. Now I understood why. These weren't his children, and on some level, he had always known it. The question was, did he know it consciously, or had it been just an unconscious awareness that had prevented him from truly bonding with them? After the children were in bed, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to confront him, but not in the way he expected. I wasn't going to scream or cry or beg him to reconsider leaving us. Instead, I was going to give him exactly what he thought he wanted, with one small addition: the truth. I found him in his home office, presumably texting with Bree, though he quickly minimized his phone screen when I knocked on the doorframe. "Can we talk?" I asked, my voice carefully neutral. He looked surprised by my calm tone. For the past week, our few interactions had been tense and emotional, filled with my desperate attempts to understand what had gone wrong and his increasingly cold responses. "Of course," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "What's on your mind?" I sat down and looked at him, really looked at him, for what felt like the first time in months. Ander was still handsome, still carried himself with that confident air that had first attracted me, but now I could see the selfishness in his features, the weakness disguised as strength, the cowardice he dressed up as ambition. Anders shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Susan, I don't think that's entirely fair. And I interrupted smoothly, someone who actually loves his children, someone who doesn't see family life as a burden to be endured, someone who doesn't blame his wife for problems that were never her fault to begin with. Something in my tone must have alerted him that this conversation was heading somewhere he hadn't anticipated, because his expression became more guarded. What are you trying to say?
I reached into my purse and pulled out the envelope I had been carrying around for 3 days, ever since I had printed out all the DNA test results and Dr. Fontaine's old medical records that I had requested from his former clinic. I'm saying that before you leave us for your fertile young secretary, there's something you should probably know about the children you're so eager to abandon. I placed the envelope on his desk, my hands steady despite the way my heart was pounding. Go ahead, I said quietly. Open it. Anders stared at the envelope as if it might contain a bomb. What is this? It's the truth, I replied. The truth about our family. The truth about you. The truth about everything you've blamed me for all these years. With trembling fingers, he opened the envelope and pulled out the first document, Emma's DNA test results. I watched his face as he read, saw the exact moment when understanding dawned, followed immediately by horror. The color drained from Anders' face as he stared at the DNA results, his hands trembling as he flipped through page after page of scientific evidence that shattered everything he thought he knew about our family. Lucas's results, Sophie's results, all showing the same devastating conclusion. He was not his biological father. This can't be right, he whispered, his voice barely audible. There has to be some mistake. There's no mistake, I said calmly, watching as his world collapsed in real time. I had the tests run by 3 different companies. The results are conclusive. He looked up at me then, his eyes wild with confusion and something that looked almost like panic. But how is this possible? We never. No, I never had an affair, I confirmed, my voice steady and clear. But apparently neither of us ever bothered to question what was actually happening during those fertility treatments with Dr. Fontaine. I reached across the desk and pulled out another set of documents, the medical records I had obtained from Dr. Fontaine's former clinic after threatening legal action. It seems our good doctor had some very unconventional ideas about how to help couples conceive. Instead of using properly screened donor sperm like he told us he was doing, he was using his own genetic material. There are at least 12 other families who discovered the same thing we just did. Anders' hands were shaking so violently now that he could barely hold the papers. You're telling me that our children, that Emma and Lucas and Sophie, are Dr. Fontaine's biological children, yes. Which means that for 8 years, you've been raising another man's kids while convinced that I was the one with fertility problems. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. All those cruel comments about my supposed inability to give him children, all the shame and self-doubt he had heaped on me, all the times his mother had suggested I wasn't woman enough to provide him with a proper family, and it turned out he was the one who was infertile. But the treatments, he stammered. Dr. Fontaine said, he told us that my sample was just being enhanced. He lied, I said simply, to both of us. But the difference is, I loved those children regardless of whose genetic material created them. You, apparently, could never quite bond with them, and now we both know why. He set the papers down and buried his face in his hands. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was his ragged breathing. When he finally looked up, his expression was a mixture of devastation and something that looked almost like relief. I always wondered, he admitted quietly. I never said anything because I thought maybe I wasn't cut out to be a father. But I never felt what other men described feeling when they looked at their children. I thought there was something wrong with me. There is something wrong with you, I said, my voice hardening. But it's not your inability to father children biologically. It's your complete lack of loyalty, compassion, or integrity. Those children have loved you unconditionally for their entire lives, and you're abandoning them for a woman who you think can give you something you've never actually been able to create? His head snapped up. What do you mean? I smiled then, a cold, satisfied expression that I felt down to my bones. I mean, your precious Bree, Ander, the fertile young woman who's supposedly carrying your baby. Well, I have some news about that too. I pulled out my phone and showed him a screenshot I had taken earlier that day, a social media post from one of Bree's friends congratulating her on her pregnancy and mentioning how excited she was that her boyfriend Carl was going to be such a great father. Carl, not Ander. It seems your secretary has been just as deceptive as you have been, I continued, watching as this final revelation hit him like a physical blow. She's pregnant, all right, but the baby isn't yours. Just like our children aren't yours, just like you're never going to have biological children with anyone. Because the problem was never with me, Ander. It was always with you. He stared at the phone screen, then back at the DNA results, then at me. I could see his mind racing, trying to process the magnitude of his miscalculations. So, let me make sure I understand this correctly, I said, my voice dripping with the satisfaction of long-delayed justice. You're leaving a woman who gave you 3 beautiful children who adore you, even though they're not biologically yours, for a woman who's pregnant with another man's child, believing that she can give you the biological children that you are physically incapable of creating? The silence that followed was deafening. Ander looked like a man who had just realized he had burned down his house while standing inside it. Susan, I didn't know. If I had known...
If you had known what? I interrupted. That you were infertile? That would have changed how you treated your family? That would have made you a better father, a better husband? I stood up, gathering the documents that had just destroyed his entire worldview. The truth is, Ander, biology never mattered. What mattered was love, loyalty, and commitment, and you failed at all 3. The next few days passed in a surreal haze. Ander didn't move out as planned. Instead, he wandered around our house like a ghost, shell-shocked and hollow-eyed, trying to process the complete destruction of everything he thought he knew about his life. He kept staring at the children during meals, studying their faces as if seeing them for the first time, which, in many ways, he was. I felt no sympathy for him. After months of his emotional cruelty, after watching him systematically destroy our children's sense of security while blaming me for problems that were entirely his creation, I found his suffering deeply satisfying. Justice, it seemed, had a way of serving itself when you were patient enough to let it unfold. But what I hadn't anticipated was how quickly word would spread. It started when Ander failed to show up for an important client presentation, something that was completely unlike his usual professional behavior. Mark Jerome called the house looking for him, concerned because Ander wasn't answering his phone and had missed several crucial meetings. He's dealing with some personal issues, I told Mark, keeping my voice carefully neutral, family matters that require his immediate attention. But Ander's absence from work stretched into a second day, then a third. And in a company as small and gossip-prone as Fontaine & Associates, people started asking questions. It was Bree who inadvertently started the chain reaction that would bring everything into the light. Panicked by Ander's sudden unavailability and apparently feeling guilty about their affair, she made the mistake of confiding in her friend Edie from Human Resources. Yes, the same Edie who happened to be Ander's mother. Small companies have a way of creating these uncomfortable coincidences. According to the version that eventually made its way back to me, Bree had gone to Edie in tears, worried that Ander was having second thoughts about leaving his family for her. She wanted to know if there was anything she could do to support him through this difficult transition. Edie, who had never been particularly bright but had always been fiercely protective of her son, apparently saw this as an opportunity to play matchmaker and ensure that Ander made the right choice. She started making subtle inquiries around the office about Ander's situation, trying to gauge whether his colleagues thought he would be happier with a woman who better understood his professional aspirations. What she didn't expect was for people to start asking pointed questions about the timing of Bree's pregnancy and Ander's sudden emotional crisis. The truth came out during what was supposed to be a routine staff meeting. Mark had called everyone together to discuss Ander's unexplained absence and how to redistribute his client responsibilities. Someone mentioned that Bree had also been out sick for several days, and another colleague made an innocent comment about hoping it wasn't morning sickness affecting her work performance. That's when Carl Asher, the company's IT director and Bree's actual boyfriend, made a comment that stopped the entire meeting cold. Morning sickness shouldn't be affecting her work, he said with obvious pride. She's been handling the pregnancy really well. We're both excited about becoming parents. The silence that followed was deafening. Several people looked confused, while others began putting pieces together with expressions of dawning horror. Edie, realizing that something had gone terribly wrong with her matchmaking efforts, tried to smooth things over. "Oh, I think there might be some confusion about who the father is." But Carl wasn't confused at all. "What do you mean? I'm the father. Bree and I have been trying to get pregnant for 6 months. This baby is definitely ours." Within hours, the entire office knew that Ander had been having an affair with a woman who was pregnant with another man's child, while simultaneously abandoning his own family under the belief that his secretary could give him the children his wife supposedly couldn't. Mark called me that evening. "Susan," he said, his voice carefully professional but tinged with something that sounded like sympathy, "I think you should know that there's been some developments at the office regarding Ander's situation." "What kind of developments?" I asked, though I was already smiling. I had a feeling that Ander's carefully constructed facade was about to crumble in the most public way possible. "Well, it seems that the young woman he's been involved with is pregnant with someone else's child, and apparently this has been common knowledge among her friends for some time. Ander apparently was the only one who didn't know." I let out a long, satisfied sigh. How unfortunate for him. "Susan," Mark continued, his voice becoming more personal, "I've known Ander for 5 years, and I've always respected him as a colleague. But what he's done to you and those children, it's unconscionable. If there's anything you need, anything at all, please don't hesitate to ask." "Actually," I said, an idea forming in my mind, "there is something you could help me with. I think it's time Ander's colleagues understood exactly what kind of man they've been working with." The next morning, I did something I had never done in our entire marriage. I showed up at Ander's office unannounced. I walked through the gleaming lobby of Fontaine & Associates, carrying a leather portfolio and wearing my best navy suit, the one I had bought for our anniversary dinner 2 years ago, when I still believed we had something worth celebrating. The receptionist, a young woman named Claire, who had always been friendly during company events, looked surprised to see me. "Mrs. Michaels, how nice to see you. Are you here to surprise Ander? He's been out for a few days, but I think he's supposed to be back today." "Actually," I said with a smile that felt sharp around the edges, "I'm here to see Mark Jerome. He's expecting me." The elevator ride to the executive floor felt like ascending to a battlefield where I finally held the winning hand. For so long, this building had represented everything that Ander valued more than our family: his precious career, his professional ambitions, the world where he felt important and respected. Now it was going to become the stage for his complete humiliation. Mark's office was spacious and modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a stunning view of the Chicago skyline. He stood up when I entered, his expression a mixture of professional courtesy and genuine concern. "Susan, thank you for coming. Please have a seat." I settled into the chair across from his desk and opened my portfolio, pulling out carefully organized copies of the DNA results, Dr. Fontaine's medical records, and several other documents I had compiled over the past few days. "Mark," I began, "I want to be completely transparent with you about what's been happening with Ander, because I believe his recent behavior and poor judgment reflect poorly not just on him, but on this entire company." Mark leaned forward, his attention focused. "I'm listening." "My husband has been telling people, including, I suspect, some of his colleagues here, that he's leaving me because I'm unable to have children. He's painted himself as a man trapped in a marriage with a defective wife, forced to seek happiness elsewhere with a woman who can supposedly give him the family he deserves." I slid the first set of documents across the desk. These are DNA test results proving that our 3 children are not biologically his, not because I had an affair, but because Ander is completely infertile and has been throughout our entire marriage. Mark's eyebrows rose as he scanned the results. "This is quite unexpected." "It gets worse," I continued, sliding across the medical records. "The children were conceived through fertility treatments, where our doctor used his own genetic material without our knowledge or consent. Ander and I were both victims of medical fraud. But while I loved and raised these children regardless of their biological origins, Ander's unconscious knowledge of the truth prevented him from ever truly bonding with them." I paused, watching Mark process this information. Now, instead of dealing with his own fertility issues honestly, he's chosen to abandon 3 children who love him desperately for a secretary who is pregnant with another man's child. Mark's expression darkened. "Are you saying that Bree Sanders' pregnancy is definitely not Anders?" "Yes. She's been in a committed relationship with Carl Asher for over a year. The timing of her pregnancy coincides perfectly with their relationship timeline, not with her affair with my husband." I pulled out my phone and showed him the social media posts I had screenshotted, photos of Bree and Carl together, her announcement about their pregnancy, his excited comments about becoming a father. "So let me make sure I understand this," Mark said slowly. "Ander has destroyed his family, abandoned his responsibilities, and compromised his professional reputation for a woman who was never actually available to him, believing she could give him children that he is physically incapable of fathering." "Exactly, and he's done all of this while telling anyone who would listen that I was the problem." Mark was quiet for a long moment, studying the documents spread across his desk. Finally, he looked up at me with an expression of disgust that wasn't directed at me. "Susan, I have to ask, what do you want from this conversation? What outcome are you looking for?" I had been hoping he would ask that question. I want Anders' colleagues to understand what kind of man they've been working with. I want them to know that when he inevitably returns to work with some sob story about his personal life falling apart, the reality is that he destroyed everything good in his life through his own selfishness and stupidity. I leaned forward slightly, and I want everyone to know that when his secretary's pregnancy becomes impossible to hide, and when it becomes obvious that the baby doesn't belong to him, he'll have no one to blame but himself for believing he could trade his family for a fantasy. Mark nodded slowly. "I think that's more than fair. In fact, I think the entire leadership team should be aware of this situation, especially given how it might affect workplace dynamics going forward." "I was hoping you'd say that," I replied, feeling satisfaction bloom in my chest. "Because there's one more thing you should know. Ander is supposed to be back in the office today, and I have a feeling he's going to try to control the narrative about what's happening in his personal life. I thought you might want to be prepared with the actual facts." Just then, Claire's voice came over the intercom. "Mr. Jerome, Ander Michaels is here to see you. He says it's urgent." Mark and I exchanged a look that was part conspiracy, part anticipation. "Send him in," Mark said into the intercom, then turned to me. "Are you prepared for this?" "I've been preparing for this moment for months," I replied, settling back in my chair with the confidence of someone who held all the winning cards.
The door opened, and Ander walked in, looking haggard and disheveled in a way I had never seen before. His usually immaculate appearance was replaced by wrinkled clothes, stubble, and the hollow-eyed look of a man who hadn't slept in days. When he saw me sitting there, he stopped dead in his tracks. "Susan!" What are you doing here? Having a conversation with your boss about your recent performance issues, I said calmly. Please sit down. I think you'll find this discussion illuminating. Ander looked between Mark and me, clearly trying to assess the situation. He took the remaining chair, his movements cautious and uncertain. Mark, he began, his voice taking on the smooth, professional tone he used when trying to manage difficult clients. I know I've been out unexpectedly, and I apologize for any inconvenience. I've been dealing with some personal matters that required immediate attention. Yes, Mark said dryly. Your wife was just explaining those personal matters to me. Quite thoroughly, actually. The color drained from Anders' face. What exactly has she told you? I opened my portfolio again, pulling out a fresh set of the documents I had shown Mark. I've told him the truth, Ander. All of it. I slid the papers across to him, watching him stare at them with the same horror he had shown 3 days earlier. I've explained about your infertility, about the children's actual parentage, and about your secretary's pregnancy. Anders' hands trembled as he picked up the DNA results. Susan, please, this is a private family matter. It doesn't need to involve. It stopped being a private family matter when you started telling your colleagues that you were leaving me because I couldn't give you children. When you made me the villain in your story to justify your affair. Mark leaned forward, his expression stern. Ander, is it true that you've been having an affair with Bree Sanders? Anders' jaw worked silently for a moment before he nodded reluctantly. Yes, but... And is it true that you believed she was pregnant with your child? Another nod, this one barely perceptible. And now you've discovered that not only is the baby not yours, but that you're completely infertile and have been throughout your marriage? The silence that followed was deafening. Anders seemed to shrink in his chair, the weight of his miscalculations crushing him visibly. Mark continued, his voice taking on the cold professional tone reserved for serious disciplinary conversations. Let me see if I understand the situation correctly. You've abandoned your family based on a fundamental misunderstanding of your own biology. You've been conducting an affair with a subordinate employee, creating a hostile work environment, and you've been spreading false information about your wife's fertility issues to justify your actions. I didn't know any of this. If you had known that you were infertile, you would have been a better father to children who loved you regardless of genetics. If you had known that Bree was using you as a distraction from her real relationship, you would have appreciated the family you actually had. Ander looked at me with something that might have been desperation. Susan, please, I made mistakes, terrible mistakes, but we can work through this. No, I said firmly, we can't. Because this isn't about mistakes, Ander. This is about character. This is about the fact that when you thought I was the problem, you discarded me without hesitation. When you thought Bree could give you something better, you abandoned 3 children who called you daddy. I stood up, gathering my documents. The difference between us is that I loved our children regardless of their biology. You couldn't love them even when you thought they were yours. Mark cleared his throat. Ander, I think it's best if you take some extended time off to sort out your personal situation. The company will be conducting a review of your conduct, particularly regarding your relationship with Miss Sanders. Mark, please. But Mark held up a hand. The review will determine whether your actions constitute grounds for termination. In the meantime, I suggest you focus on the mess you've made of your personal life. I walked toward the door, then paused and turned back to Ander one final time. Oh, and Ander, when Bree's baby is born, and it's obvious that Carl is the father, when your mother realizes that her precious son destroyed his family for absolutely nothing,
When everyone in your professional and social circles understands exactly what kind of man you really are, remember that you did this to yourself. The last thing I saw before the door closed was Ander burying his face in his hands, finally understanding the magnitude of what he had lost. And for the first time in months, I felt truly free. Walking out of that office building felt like stepping into a completely different life. The autumn air was crisp and clean, and for the first time in months, I could breathe deeply without feeling like there was a weight pressing down on my chest. I had spent so long carrying the burden of Ander's accusations, his cruelty, his systematic destruction of my self-worth, that I had forgotten what it felt like to stand tall with the truth on my side. But my work wasn't finished yet. That evening, I called Julie and asked her to watch the children for a few hours. I have one more stop to make, and then this nightmare will finally be over. Julie arrived within 30 minutes, taking one look at my face and immediately understanding that something significant had shifted. "You look different," she said, studying me carefully. "Stronger." "I feel different," I admitted. "I feel like myself again."
My destination was Edie's house, Ander's mother, the woman who had spent months undermining my confidence and making cruel comments about my supposed fertility issues. If anyone deserved to know the truth about her precious son's spectacular failure, it was the woman who had been his most enthusiastic enabler. Edie lived in a pristine suburban home that perfectly reflected her personality. Everything was immaculate, expensive, and designed to impress rather than provide comfort. When she opened the door and saw me standing on her porch, her expression immediately became guarded. "Susan," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "This is unexpected. Is everything all right?" "Actually, Edie, everything is perfect. May I come in? I have some news about Ander that I think you'll find very interesting." She hesitated for a moment, clearly sensing that this conversation wasn't going to go the way she expected, but her curiosity won out. "Of course, come in." Her living room was a showcase of beige and gold, with family photos prominently displayed on every surface. Most of them featured Ander at various stages of his life, graduating from college, accepting business awards, looking successful and confident. Notably absent were any recent photos of him with our children. "Can I offer you some tea?" Edie asked, maintaining the pretense of politeness even though I could see the tension in her shoulders. "No, thank you. I won't be staying long. I just wanted to share some information with you before you hear it from someone else." I sat down on her pristine sofa and pulled out my phone, opening it to the photos I had taken of the DNA test results. "Edie, you've spent a lot of time over the past few months making comments about my supposed inability to give Ander children. You've suggested that I'm somehow defective, that a real woman would be able to provide him with the family he deserves." Her chin lifted slightly, a defensive gesture I recognized from years of interaction. "I was simply expressing concern for my son's happiness." "Well, I have some wonderful news for you. It turns out that I'm perfectly fertile. Always have been. The problem was never with me." I handed her my phone, watching as she read the DNA results with growing confusion and alarm. "I don't understand," she said slowly. "What are these?" "Those are DNA test results proving that Emma, Lucas, and Sophie are not biologically Anders, which means that your son, the man you've been defending and enabling, is completely infertile and has been throughout our entire marriage." The phone slipped from her hands, clattering onto her glass coffee table. "That's impossible. There must be some mistake." "There's no mistake. I had the tests run by 3 different companies to be absolutely certain. Your son cannot father children, Edie. He never could. And instead of dealing with that reality honestly, he chose to blame me, humiliate me, and ultimately abandon his family for a woman who is pregnant with another man's baby." Edie's face had gone completely white. "Another man's baby?" "Oh yes," I said, settling back into the cushions with satisfaction.
Your son's precious secretary, the woman he's been having an affair with, the one who's supposedly pregnant with the child he could never give me, well, she's been in a committed relationship with her actual boyfriend for over a year. The baby is definitely not Anders. I watched as the implications crashed over her like a wave. This woman who had spent months making me feel small and inadequate was finally understanding that her son had destroyed everything good in his life based on lies and delusions. So let me make sure you understand the situation, I continued, my voice taking on the same cold tone she had used with me so many times. Your son abandoned 3 beautiful children who loved him unconditionally based on fertility issues that were entirely his own fault. He threw away a devoted wife who had given him 8 years of love and loyalty. And he did all of this for a woman who was never actually available to him and a baby that could never be his. Edie opened and closed her mouth several times, but no words came out. I thought you should know, I said, standing up and smoothing my skirt, so that when he comes crawling back to you for support and sympathy, you'll understand exactly what kind of man you raised. The fallout from my revelations spread through Anders' life like wildfire through dry grass. Within a week, the entire story had made its way through his professional and social circles, each retelling adding new layers of humiliation to his already devastating situation. Mark had been true to his word about informing the company's leadership team. By Friday, Anders had been placed on indefinite administrative leave pending a full investigation into his conduct with Bree. The official reason given to staff was violations of company policy regarding workplace relationships. But everyone knew the real story. In a small company like Fontaine & Associates, secrets had a very short shelf life. Bree, meanwhile, had requested an immediate transfer to a different department after the truth about her pregnancy became public knowledge. According to the office gossip that Julie had been feeding me through her friend who worked in accounting, Bree was mortified that her private relationship had become the subject of company-wide speculation. She had apparently never intended for her flirtation with Anders to become anything serious, certainly never expected him to leave his family for her. Carl, her actual boyfriend, had initially been confused by all the drama, but ultimately found the situation more amusing than threatening. I never saw Anders as competition, he had allegedly told their mutual friends. Bree and I have been planning this baby for months. I'm not sure what delusion he was living in.
But it was Edie's reaction that provided me with the most satisfaction. 3 days after my visit to her house, she showed up at my door unannounced, looking haggard and years older than she had just a week earlier. When I opened the door, I could see that she had been crying, her usually perfect makeup smudged and her carefully styled hair disheveled. "I need to see him," she said without preamble. "Anders, is he here?" "He's upstairs," I replied, making no move to invite her in. "But I'm not sure he wants to see anyone right now." "Please, Susan," she said, and for the first time in the 8 years I had known her, Edie Michaels looked genuinely humble. "I need to talk to him, and to you." Against my better judgment, I stepped aside and let her enter. She followed me into the living room, where the children were playing with their toys, blissfully unaware of the adult drama swirling around them. When they saw their grandmother, they ran to greet her with the uncomplicated affection that children show even to adults who don't deserve it. Watching Edie hug Emma, Lucas, and Sophie while knowing what I now knew about their parentage was surreal. These children had never been her biological grandchildren, but they had loved her anyway, had spent years trying to win her approval and affection. "I'll get Anders," I said, leaving her with the children while I went upstairs. I found him in what had once been our bedroom, staring out the window with the hollow expression that had become his default since learning the truth. He had aged years in just a week, the confident, arrogant man I had married, replaced by someone who looked broken and lost. "Your mother is here," I told him. "She wants to talk to you." He turned to look at me, his eyes filled with something that might have been hope. "Did she say what about?" "I imagine it's about the fact that she spent months insulting me for fertility problems that were actually yours," I replied without sympathy. "Or maybe about how she encouraged you to abandon your family for a fantasy that was never real." Anders winced, but followed me downstairs. When he saw his mother sitting on our couch with Sophie on her lap, something in his expression softened slightly. "Mom," he said quietly. Edie looked up at him, her eyes immediately filling with tears. "Oh, Ander, what have you done?" The conversation that followed was one of the most uncomfortable I had ever witnessed. Edie, who had always been Ander's most devoted supporter, systematically dismantled every excuse he tried to offer for his behavior. She pointed out that even if the children weren't biologically his, they had loved him as their father. She reminded him that I had been a devoted wife who had never given him any reason to doubt my loyalty. And most devastatingly, she forced him to confront the fact that his affair with Bree had been based on nothing more than his own ego and midlife crisis. "You threw away everything real for something that was never there," she told him, her voice thick with disappointment. "Those children upstairs call you daddy, and you walked away from them like they meant nothing." "I didn't know," Ander kept repeating, as if his ignorance somehow excused his choices. "I didn't know they weren't mine. I didn't know I was infertile. I didn't know Bree was with someone else." "You didn't know because you didn't want to know," Edie replied sharply. "You wanted someone to blame for your own unhappiness, so you blamed Susan. You wanted to believe that leaving your family would make you feel young and important again, so you convinced yourself that Bree could give you something Susan couldn't." I stood in the doorway listening to this conversation, feeling vindicated in a way I hadn't expected. For years, Edie had been my harshest critic, and now she was finally seeing her son clearly. When Edie finally left that evening, she paused at the front door and turned to me with an expression I had never seen on her face before: genuine remorse. "Susan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I owe you an apology that I can never adequately express. The things I said to you, the way I treated you, I was so wrong." I stood there, holding the door open, watching this woman who had made my life miserable for months, finally confronting the reality of her son's character. "I convinced myself that Ander could do no wrong," she continued, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I wanted so desperately to believe that any problems in your marriage had to be your fault, because the alternative was admitting that I had raised a man who could abandon his family without a second thought." "Edie," I said quietly, "your apology doesn't change what happened. It doesn't undo the months of cruelty, the way you made me question my own worth." "I know," she replied, nodding through her tears. "I know it doesn't. But I need you to know that those children in there are the best thing that ever happened to this family, regardless of whose DNA they carry. And you've been a better mother to them than Ander has been a father." After she left, I found Ander still sitting in the living room, staring at his hands as if they held answers to questions he was afraid to ask. "Even my own mother thinks I'm a failure," he said without looking up. "Your mother thinks you made catastrophic choices," I corrected. "There's a difference." He was quiet for a long moment before speaking again. "Susan, is there any chance, any possibility that we could try to work through this?" The question didn't surprise me, but my reaction to it did. A month ago, if Ander had asked me to forgive him, I might have been tempted to try. The woman who had spent 8 years believing that love meant enduring everything, forgiving everything, might have seen his brokenness as an opportunity for redemption. But I wasn't that woman anymore. "No, Ander," I said with a clarity that surprised us both. "No, Ander," I said, "there isn't." "But the children—"
The children deserve better than a father who sees them as burdens to be endured, I interrupted. They deserve better than parents who stay together out of obligation or guilt. And frankly, so do I. He looked up at me then, and I saw something in his eyes that looked almost like panic. What does that mean? It means that I'm filing for divorce. It means that I'm going to build a life for myself and the children that doesn't include someone who sees us as obstacles to his happiness. "Susan, please," he said, standing up as if he was going to reach for me. "I made mistakes, terrible mistakes, but we have a history. We have 8 years together. That has to count for something." "It does count for something," I agreed. "It counts as 8 years of my life that I'll never get back. 8 years of trying to be enough for someone who was never capable of appreciating what he had." The divorce proceedings that followed were swift and surprisingly uncontested.
Ander, perhaps realizing that he had no moral ground to stand on, agreed to every term I proposed. I got the house, primary custody of the children, and more than generous financial support. He got supervised visitation rights and the freedom to rebuild his shattered reputation if he could. But the most satisfying part of the entire process came 3 months later when Bree's baby was born. Carl had been posting updates throughout the pregnancy, sharing ultrasound photos and excitement about becoming a father. When little James Carl Asher finally arrived, the family resemblance was unmistakable. The baby looked exactly like Carl, with his dark hair and distinctive nose, making it impossible for anyone to claim confusion about paternity. Ander, who had apparently been harboring some last desperate hope that the timing might work out in his favor, was finally forced to confront the absolute finality of his situation. He had destroyed his family for a woman who had never belonged to him, believing she could give him children he could never have, only to watch her build the exact life he had always claimed to want with someone else. The irony was so complete, so perfectly devastating, that I almost felt sorry for him. But what surprised me most was how quickly life moved forward without him. The children, who I had worried would be traumatized by their father's absence, seemed to adapt with remarkable resilience. Emma threw herself into her studies with renewed focus. Lucas discovered a talent for drawing and spent hours creating elaborate superhero comics. Sophie, too young to fully understand what had happened, simply accepted that Daddy didn't live with us anymore, but still came to visit sometimes. And me? For the first time in years, I remembered what it felt like to wake up without the weight of someone else's disappointment pressing down on my chest. I started taking evening classes at the community college, something I had always wanted to do but had never found time for when I was trying to manage Ander's needs and expectations. I reconnected with friends I had lost touch with during my marriage. I began to rediscover the woman I had been before I became Mrs. Ander Michaels. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I received an unexpected phone call that would change everything once again. It was from Dr. Sarah Chen, a genetics counselor at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. "Mrs. Fontaine," she said, I had legally returned to my maiden name, "I'm calling because you were listed as one of the affected families in the Carl Fontaine fertility fraud case. We've been conducting follow-up DNA analysis for all the children involved, and I have some additional information that I think you'll want to hear." My heart started racing. I had thought we were done with revelations, that all the truth had finally come to light. What kind of additional information? "Could you come in for an appointment? This is the kind of conversation that's better had in person." 2 days later, I sat in Dr. Chen's office while Emma, Lucas, and Sophie played in the children's area down the hall. The genetic counselor was a kind woman in her 40s with gentle eyes and the sort of calm demeanor that suggested she was used to delivering life-changing news. "Susan," she began, consulting the file in front of her, "the DNA analysis we've been conducting on all of Dr. Fontaine's cases has revealed some patterns that we weren't expecting." She pulled out several charts and genetic profiles that meant nothing to her but seemed significant to her. It appears that Dr. Fontaine wasn't just using his own genetic material randomly. He was actually making deliberate choices based on genetic compatibility and health factors. In essence, he was conducting his own unauthorized genetic engineering experiment. I felt a chill run down my spine. What does that mean for my children? It means that Emma, Lucas, and Sophie weren't just conceived through fertility fraud. They were specifically designed to be exceptional. Dr. Fontaine chose his genetic contribution based on your own genetic profile to optimize for intelligence, health, and overall health outcomes. Dr. Chen leaned forward, her expression growing more serious. "Your children are part of a group of approximately 15 kids who all show remarkably similar genetic advantages. They're likely to be significantly above average in terms of cognitive ability, disease resistance, and overall health outcomes." The room felt like it was spinning. "Are you telling me that my children are some kind of genetic experiment?" "In a way, yes. But Susan, I want to be clear. They're not artificial or unnatural in any way. They're still completely human, still completely your children. Dr. Fontaine essentially gave them the genetic equivalent of winning the lottery.
I thought about Emma's remarkable academic performance, how she had always seemed to grasp concepts that other children her age struggled with. I thought about Lucas's artistic abilities and his unusually mature emotional intelligence. Even Sophie, at 4 years old, was already showing signs of being exceptionally bright and healthy. There's something else, Dr. Chen continued. We've been in contact with all the affected families, and several of them have expressed interest in forming a support group. These children are going to face unique challenges as they grow up, and their parents are going to need specialized guidance. She handed me a folder containing contact information and research materials. I know this is a lot to process, but I wanted you to have all the information available to you. As I drove home that afternoon, my mind was reeling with the implications of what I had learned. My children weren't just the products of fertility fraud. They were the result of a deliberate attempt to create genetically superior humans. It was both horrifying and strangely vindicating. Ander had abandoned these extraordinary children because he couldn't bond with them, never knowing that they represented everything he had always claimed to want, exceptional offspring who would excel at whatever they chose to pursue. That evening, I called Julie to share the news. "So let me get this straight," she said, after I had explained everything Dr. Chen had told me. "Ander left you and the kids because he thought you couldn't give him children, only to discover that the children you did give him are essentially genetic prodigies?" "That's exactly right," I confirmed, unable to keep the satisfaction out of my voice. "Susan," Julie said, and I could hear the awe in her voice, "do you realize how completely this vindicates everything you've been through? Ander didn't just throw away a family, he threw away 3 children who are going to change the world." Over the following weeks, I reached out to the other families Dr. Chen had mentioned. We formed a support network that quickly became one of the most important parts of my new life. These parents understood the unique challenges we faced, how to handle children who are academically years ahead of their peers, how to manage the ethical questions surrounding their conception, how to help them navigate a world that might not always understand their abilities. But more than that, connecting with these families gave me a sense of purpose I had never experienced before. We weren't just raising children, we were raising the next generation of leaders, innovators, and changemakers. And Ander, he was completely excluded from all of it. The transformation in our lives over the next year was nothing short of remarkable. Emma was accepted into a gifted program that challenged her in ways I had never imagined possible. At 9 years old, she was reading at a high school level and had developed a fascination with molecular biology that left her teachers scrambling to find appropriate materials for her. Lucas, now 7, had his artwork featured in a local gallery's children's exhibition, with several pieces selling to collectors who were amazed by the emotional depth and technical skill of someone so young. Even Sophie, at 5 years old, was already reading chapter books and had taught herself basic piano by watching YouTube videos. Watching them flourish gave me a sense of pride and purpose that made all the pain of the past year feel worthwhile. These weren't just my children. They were extraordinary human beings who were going to contribute something meaningful to the world. It was during this period of growth and discovery that I met Daniel Harrison. He was the father of one of the other Dr. Fontaine children, a brilliant 8-year-old named Maya, who had become fast friends with Emma through our support group activities. Daniel was a widower, having lost his wife to cancer when Maya was just 3 years old. Like me, he was navigating the challenges of single parenthood while trying to understand the implications of his child's exceptional abilities. Our first real conversation happened during a group picnic at Millennium Park. While the children played together, displaying the kind of sophisticated games and conversations that never failed to amaze the adults watching them, Daniel and I found ourselves sitting on a bench talking about everything except our unusual circumstances. "It's strange," he said, watching Maya and Emma collaborate on an elaborate chalk drawing that appeared to be a detailed map
of an imaginary world complete with economic systems and political structures. Sometimes I watch her and I can't believe she's only 8. Other times, she's just a little girl who wants me to check under her bed for monsters. I know exactly what you mean. Lucas created a comic book series last month with storylines that rival anything I've seen from professional writers, but he still cries if he thinks I might leave him at daycare too long. He laughed, a warm sound that made something inside my chest flutter in a way I hadn't experienced in years. Maya asked me last week if I was lonely. Not sad, specifically lonely. When I told her sometimes I was, she suggested that perhaps I should find another adult who understood our unique family situation. 8 years old and already playing matchmaker? Apparently, she's been discussing it with the kids. They've decided that several of the single parents in our group would be compatible based on their observations of our interactions. I found myself smiling genuinely for the first time in months. Emma mentioned something similar. She said she thought you seemed intellectually stimulating and that Maya needed additional maternal guidance figures. Intellectually stimulating, Daniel repeated, grinning. High praise from a 9-year-old who's reading graduate-level textbooks.
Over the following months, Daniel and I began spending more time together outside of the group activities. We discovered that we shared not just the unique challenges of raising exceptional children, but also similar values, interests, and dreams for the future. He was kind, patient, and genuinely fascinated by my children's abilities in a way that felt supportive rather than overwhelming. More importantly, he understood the journey I had been on. He knew what it was like to have your entire worldview shattered and rebuilt. He understood the complexity of loving children who were simultaneously yours completely and the product of circumstances beyond your control. Our relationship developed slowly, carefully, with both of us conscious of the need to protect our children from any additional upheaval. But when Daniel finally kissed me on a quiet evening after the kids had fallen asleep during a movie night, it felt like coming home to a version of myself I had forgotten existed. The children, with their characteristic directness, were thrilled by this development. "Finally," Emma said when we told them we were officially dating. "Maya and I have been waiting for you two to figure this out for months." "We did some research on attachment theory and family dynamics," Lucas added matter-of-factly. "All the data suggested you would be compatible." Even Sophie nodded approvingly. "Daniel makes good pancakes and Maya shares her toys. This is a logical development." It was around this time that Ander made his final attempt at re-entering our lives. He had been largely absent since the divorce, showing up sporadically for his scheduled visitation days, but never really engaging with the children in any meaningful way. His career had never recovered from the scandal, and according to mutual acquaintances, he had been drifting from job to job, unable to rebuild the professional reputation he had once valued so highly. But when he learned about the children's exceptional abilities, news that had spread through our former social circle as their achievements became more public, something changed in his approach. He called me on a Tuesday evening, his voice carrying a tone I hadn't heard since the early days of our marriage, genuine excitement. "Susan, I've been hearing incredible things about the kids. Emma's acceptance into the advanced program, Lucas's art exhibition. I had no idea they were so gifted." "Where are you going with this, Ander?" I asked, already dreading the direction of the conversation. "I've been thinking," Ander continued, and I could hear the familiar note of self-serving calculation creeping into his voice. "Maybe I was too hasty about the divorce. Maybe we gave up on our family too quickly." I almost laughed at the audacity. "You think you were too hasty? You abandoned us, Ander. You left 3 children who loved you because you thought I was defective." "But that was before I knew, before I understood what incredible children we have. Susan, do you realize what this means? Emma could be the next Marie Curie. Lucas could be the next Picasso. Sophie could be anything she wants to be." "We," I repeated slowly. "You keep saying we and our children, But you walked away from them, remember? You told me they were domestic obligations that were holding you back from your real ambitions. I was wrong, he admitted, but even his apology sounded calculated. I was going through a difficult time, making poor decisions, but now I see clearly. These children need their father. They need stability, a complete family unit. What they need, I said, my voice growing colder, is people in their lives who love them unconditionally, not someone who only shows interest when they prove their worth through achievements. Ander was quiet for a moment, then tried a different approach. Think about their future, Susan. Think about what I could provide for them now that I understand their potential. The best schools, the best opportunities, connections that could open doors. Stop, I interrupted. Just stop. You're talking about them like they're investments in your portfolio, not children who deserve love and stability. That's not fair. I'm talking about giving them every advantage. The way you gave Bree every advantage, the way you threw away your family for a fantasy that was never real. Do you have any idea what you put them through, Ander? Do you know that Lucas still asks sometimes why Daddy doesn't love us anymore? The silence that followed was telling. Ander was never good at dealing with the emotional consequences of his actions. I want to be part of their lives, he said finally. I want to make things right. You are part of their lives. You have visitation rights that you barely use. You can see them every other weekend and one evening a week. But if you think I'm going to disrupt the stability and happiness we've built so you can play father to children who are suddenly interesting to you, you're delusional. Susan, please. No, Ander. The answer is no. These children deserve better than a father who only loves them when they're useful to him. They deserve better than someone who sees them as trophies to display rather than human beings to nurture. I hung up the phone and immediately called Daniel, needing to hear a voice that represented the life I was building rather than the one I had escaped. "Everything okay?" he asked, instantly picking up on my distress. "Ander wants back in," I said simply. "What did you tell him?" "The truth, that he had his chance and chose to throw it away." Daniel was quiet for a moment, and I could hear Maya chattering in the background about a science project she was working on. "How are you feeling about it?"
Angry, I admitted. Furious, actually. For 8 months, he barely acknowledged their existence. Now that he's learned they're exceptional, suddenly he wants to be Father of the Year? The kids don't know about the call? No, and I don't plan to tell them unless he actually follows through with legal action, which I doubt he will. I sank into my kitchen chair, suddenly exhausted. Daniel, what kind of person only loves their children when they prove they're worth loving? The kind of person who sees people as extensions of himself, rather than individuals deserving of respect, he replied without hesitation. Maya went through something similar with her maternal grandparents after Sarah died. They had no interest in her until they realized how brilliant she was. Then suddenly, they wanted custody, claiming they could provide better opportunities. What did you do? I reminded them that Maya wasn't a prize to be won or a project to be managed. She was a little girl who had lost her mother and needed people who loved her for who she was, not what she could achieve. His words settled something in my chest that I hadn't realized was still unsettled. You're right. That's exactly what this is. Susan, Daniel said gently, you've built something beautiful with those kids. Don't let him make you doubt that. The next morning brought vindication in an unexpected form. Emma came downstairs for breakfast with a serious expression that I had learned meant she had been thinking deeply about something important. "Mom," she said, settling into her chair with the deliberate precision she used when she had reached a conclusion about something, "I need to ask you about Dad." My heart clenched. "What about him, sweetheart?" "Lucas told me that Dad called last night. He heard you talking on the phone." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Is Dad trying to come back?"
I looked at my brilliant daughter, this 9-year-old who processed emotional situations with the same analytical precision she applied to her academic work, and decided she deserved honesty. He called, yes. He's been hearing about how well you and Lucas and Sophie are doing in school and with your special abilities, and he thinks maybe he made a mistake leaving us. Emma nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she had already suspected. But he didn't think he made a mistake when he thought we were just regular kids? The question hit me like a physical blow. Not because it was unexpected, but because it was so perfectly, devastatingly accurate. No, sweetheart, he didn't. Emma was quiet for a long moment, staring into her cereal bowl. When she looked up, her expression was sad but resolute. Then he doesn't really love us, does he? He loves what we can do, but not who we are. Out of the mouths of babes, my 9-year-old daughter had just articulated something that had taken me months of therapy and self-reflection to understand. I think you're absolutely right, I said softly. Good, because we already have people who love us for who we are. We don't need someone who only loves us for our report cards. 2 years passed in what felt like a beautiful blur of growth, discovery, and healing. Daniel and I had moved in together, creating a blended family that worked so seamlessly it sometimes took my breath away. Our children had adapted to their new family structure with the same remarkable resilience they showed in everything else, treating each other as siblings and referring to Daniel and I as their parents without any of the awkwardness I had feared. Emma, now 11, had been accepted to a prestigious STEM program for gifted children and was already conducting research projects that impressed her university-level mentors. Lucas, at 9, had published a children's book that had been picked up by a major publisher, with the proceeds going into a college fund that was growing faster than I had ever imagined possible. Sophie, at 7, was learning 3 languages simultaneously and had developed a passion for environmental science that led to her giving presentations at local elementary schools about climate change. But more importantly than their achievements, they were happy. They laughed easily, played with the unconscious joy that all children deserved, and had developed the kind of deep emotional security that came from knowing they were loved unconditionally. Daniel and I had quietly gotten engaged 6 months earlier, with a proposal that involved all 4 children presenting me with different reasons why their family would be statistically improved by making our relationship legally official. Maya had even created a PowerPoint presentation that included charts showing improved household efficiency and emotional stability metrics. We were planning a small ceremony for the following spring, something simple and focused on celebrating the family we had built together rather than the traditional wedding fanfare. It was during this period of contentment that I received the call that would provide the final perfect piece of closure to the nightmare that had started it all. The caller identified herself as Jennifer Walsh, a reporter for the Chicago Tribune who was working on a follow-up story about the Dr. Fontaine fertility fraud case. Mrs. Fontaine, I'm calling because we've been investigating the long-term outcomes for the families affected by Dr. Fontaine's actions, and your story has come up in several interviews as particularly noteworthy. Noteworthy? How? I asked, immediately wary. Well, apparently, your ex-husband has been reaching out to other affected families, claiming that he's planning to write a book about his experience as the father of genetically enhanced children. Several parents have contacted us because they're concerned about his motives. My blood ran cold. He's doing what?
From what we understand, he's been presenting himself as a victim who was deceived about his children's parentage and now wants to share his journey of reconnecting with his extraordinary family. Several people mentioned that he's been implying he's back in the children's lives full-time. I felt a familiar surge of protective fury, the same emotion that had sustained me through the worst months of our divorce. Miss Walsh, I need you to understand something very clearly. Andrew Michaels abandoned his family completely. He has minimal contact with his children and absolutely no involvement in their daily lives or achievements. Would you be willing to go on record about that? I thought about Emma's question from 2 years ago, about whether her father really loved them or just loved what they could do. I thought about all the other families in our support group who were working so hard to give their exceptional children normal, stable childhoods. Yes, I said, without hesitation, I would be very willing to go on record about that. The Chicago Tribune article came out 3 weeks later with the headline, "Fertility Fraud Father Fabricates Family Reconciliation for Book Deal." Jennifer Walsh had done her research thoroughly, interviewing multiple families from our support group and documenting the timeline of Anders' abandonment versus his recent attempts to insert himself back into the narrative. The article included quotes from me, Daniel, and several other parents, all confirming that Anders had been notably absent from his children's lives until their exceptional abilities became public knowledge. Most damaging of all, it included screenshots of social media posts where Anders had been claiming credit for raising gifted children while simultaneously posting photos from expensive vacations and business trips that coincided exactly with times he was supposed to be visiting Emma, Lucas, and Sophie. The book deal evaporated within days of the article's publication. Anders' literary agent dropped him, and the small publisher who had expressed interest released a statement distancing themselves from the project. But the most satisfying consequence came from an unexpected source, Carl Asher. Carl, who had watched Anders nearly destroy his relationship with Bree during their affair, had kept screenshots of every text message and email from that period. When he learned about Anders' book proposal, he contacted the reporter and provided evidence showing that Anders had explicitly stated his intention to start fresh with a woman who could give him real children and leave the suburban family trap behind forever. The final nail in Anders' coffin was his own words, preserved in digital format, proving that his abandonment of our family had been calculated and deliberate. 6 months later, Daniel and I were married in our backyard, surrounded by our 4 brilliant children and the families from our support group who had become our chosen family. Emma served as my maid of honor, Lucas walked me down the aisle, and Sophie scattered flower petals with scientific precision. As I watched my children laugh and play with their new father, I realized that sometimes the most devastating betrayals lead to the most beautiful new beginnings. Anders had thrown away everything real for a fantasy that never existed, but in doing so, he had freed us to find something infinitely better, a family built on genuine love, acceptance, and the kind of happiness that can't be faked or manufactured. The truth, as I had learned, always wins in the end.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.